Hi everyone. First of all, I want to apologize that I didn't get this up until today. The past couple of days have been super busy, as some of you have seen me out in the field with you the past couple of days. I also wanted to make sure that I could get some concrete examples from other students' work that I could include in this presentation. If you have a chance to watch this today or tomorrow and you feel like you need a little bit more time on your formative assessment project, it's not a problem at all. Feel free to send me an email and I will grant that extension. So this is a review of the formative assessment assignment. Some of you expressed some concerns in understanding the assignment guidelines, and as we are online for the most part for this, just so you know, are the assignment guidelines for both TNL 482 and ECE 382. That is the primary internship in early childhood for both the graduate and undergraduate section. Okay, so I wanted to clarify a couple of the purposes of this assignment. So this is not an assessment class. So some of you might be wondering why on earth that I am having you do an assessment project. Well, I've learned recently, having supervised a group of students through student teaching, and also being the person that often teaches the assessment class here at DePaul, that there are some understandings about assessment and also some lack of experience in looking at children's work for assessment in a larger group setting. If you've already taken the assessment course at DePaul, you will remember that you do a child study and you do a lot of practices around assessment with an individual child. But because when you take the assessment course, you are not in a classroom, for the most part, some of you may have been, but it isn't required that you be observing a child in a classroom. We don't have an opportunity in our program for students to look at a larger sample of children's work. So while we get some opportunities to practice looking at an individual child's work sample and evaluating it, we don't have a lot of opportunity to practice understanding assessment in a classroom-wide perspective. And for those of you that have looked ahead at EdTPA, that is a large piece of the assessment portion of EdTPA. And because you're in primary right now, it's a really good opportunity to take a look at work because the children in your classrooms are producing so much work every single day. It's a really good opportunity to go back and review that sort of planning, instruction, assessment cycle, or as Dr. Donovan and I frequently talk about, the CIA cycle, the curriculum instruction assessment cycle. And I know in this case, many of you are using an assessment that you didn't plan a lesson for, but that's completely okay. We're just looking at a piece of this right now. Also, I wanted to be clear for everyone that I know that for many of you, if not all of you, this is the first time that you're doing something like this. I do not expect this to be perfect. The point of this is to practice and to get some feedback so that the first time that you're doing this is not while you're prepping your EdTPA. Okay? For those of you that are not planning to get your license and are not taking EdTPA, this is certainly not a waste of an assignment by any means. Analyzing large group assessment is part of any work in which you do anything other than work with one child at a time. So even if you're planning on being a family support worker, you will have a caseload of families or families in a classroom that you're supporting. And you will want to look at pieces of evaluation or assessment across larger groups of people. The only time I can think of you not needing to assess larger groups of people is maybe if you only did one-on work with children. But even then, many of us that are sort of behavior therapists or developmental therapists, we're interested in looking at progress in a typical type of developmental delay, progress in a typical type of a behavior challenge, progress in a specific population. So the vast majority of the time that we are trying to sort of look at children or students or even adults' work, we're looking at it in a larger sense, not just a one-by-one. So this is a great opportunity to practice that. And I want to reiterate, this is an opportunity for practice, okay? So the purposes of this assignment is to get some practice creating an evaluation criteria for a common assessment. Just so you know, common assessment refers to an assessment that all of the children in the classroom do. It's not just a an assessment that one child does. We want you to be able to articulate and describe patterns of learning across a classroom using both a quantitative approach and a qualitative approach. So quantitative is a numerical approach. This is what we do with grades, rubric scores, checklist numbers, those kinds of things. And a qualitative approach is with words. So we want you to be able to practice describing the patterns of learning and common mistakes that you see using words across a group of children. Then we also want you to have some practice analyzing the patterns of learning. So not just describing them, but talking about what they mean and why they might have come to be. And then last but certainly not least, that this goes back to that CIA or curriculum and instruction assessment cycle, we want you to be able to talk about how the patterns of learning that you've analyzed, so the meaning that you've derived from what you've observed, could inform the way that you work with children in the future. Okay, so how is it, now that you understand that the children are capable of meeting this specific learning objective, what's next? Or if you understand that the majority of the children struggled in a specific component of a learning objective, what's next in the classroom? For the class as a whole and for individual children. Okay, so most of the class, 90% of the class, met the benchmarks for this learning standard because of these patterns that I've observed. They've demonstrated that they understand how to do fill in the blank. I don't want to use a specific example because all of your examples are going to be different. However, 2 of the children's work demonstrated that they did not comprehend what the lesson taught because of these examples. So in the future, I plan to support them by spending extra time with them, reteaching a lesson. Any of the strategies of differentiation that you've learned in your other classes would be appropriate. I hope that is clear what I mean by sort of analyze for the purpose of future instruction. So let's back up for a minute and review, because some people in this class have not taken the assessment course, but many people have. So let's take a minute and review what is formative assessment. You should have been talking about this in your curriculum courses. You have or will talk about it in your assessment courses. But a formative assessment is assessment conducted for the purpose of informing instruction or curriculum. That's what I was just describing a minute ago. This type of assessment is not designed to evaluate children, although it often also does that, okay? We often use it as benchmarks, as a way of understanding what children have learned, but the main purpose of formative assessment is not necessarily to grade children, but instead the purpose is to provide teachers with meaningful data that drives instruction. Okay, so the typical questions that drive formative assessment are, did the children learn what I taught? Are the children able to demonstrate the learning objectives? In what areas and skills are the children struggling or confused? In what areas or skills are students excelling? Sorry, I use children and students interchangeably quite frequently because so many of the students that we work with are young children, all of them, not so many. I don't use children if I'm talking about high school students. And then the data that we discover during formative assessment should lead to very specific understanding that guide future instruction. This is that piece I was just talking about on the last slide. Sort of, what do we learn from the data that changes or informs how we work with children in the future? So the typical questions that we're looking to answer in that sort of component of assessment is, do I need to reteach? Are we ready to move on? Have the children mastered skills that are necessary prerequisites for future activities? Okay, they need to learn this skill to be able to do the next one. Have they learned it? Or if I move forward, is everyone going to be unsuccessful with the next skill because they can't do this one? How do I differentiate instruction? This is something that pre-service and in-service teachers ask me all the time, like, how do I decide when and where to differentiate and what differentiation looks like? Well, it comes from the data, okay? We don't choose to differentiate just because we feel like a kid needs differentiation. It comes from what we see in their work, okay? Which children need additional support? Which children need additional challenge? We often forget about that, right? When we give kids an assessment and they get absolutely everything correct on the assessment, they don't make a single mistake, we're probably needing to challenge them more, okay? And does content need to be taught or assessed in different ways? I think all of us understand that we don't all learn the same way. You know, if you just want to look at Gardner's intelligences, you know, some of us are inherently auditory learners, and some of us are inherently visual learners, and some of us are inherently kinesthetic learners. Some of you that know me have heard me tell stories about the fact that my oldest daughter is super a kinesthetic learner. And the way that she learned the sounds of the letters of the alphabet was by me putting index cards with letters all around the floor of our house and telling her to go do a cartwheel on the letter that makes the sound f, and go do a handstand on the letter that makes the sound t, right? I could have drilled her all day on that, but by letting her use her body and explore that, it built that bridge. It made that connection for her. Okay. Some of us need directions explained in a different way. Some of us, especially young children, are struggling with fine motor skills. So assessing their ability to comprehend a story using a written assessment isn't the strongest way of assessment. If we ask them orally to tell us what they understand from the story, they can demonstrate their understanding much more significantly than if we give them a piece of paper, because their fine motor skills are delayed. Okay, so assessment, and especially formative assessment, can be used to inform all of these things. And this is why I and we as a department want you to practice this. Okay, so for the next couple of slides, I'm going to go through the steps of the assignment, and I'm also going to show you an example. For the most of the examples, I've stuck with a single one, just so you can see a particular student kind of move through the steps. And then when we get to the graphs, I will pull examples from a couple of different places so you can see how it might look different when there are different kinds of assessments and different questions being asked. Okay. So the first step of this is to select and collect a common assessment or work sample from all of the children in the class. I think everyone kind of understands this piece. It could be a worksheet, an activity, a project, photographs of an activity, anything that documents learning, painting, art, writing, any kind of a work sample. Okay, it could be videos of all the children. I don't think most of you have that. Most of you have some kind of a written piece because we're in primary. In this example, the example that I've included to the right, this is an example from a first grade classroom, and the assessment is a writing sample. And as you can see, it is asking the children to use the planning template from yesterday to describe your food using your 5 senses. So this teacher was asking this group of first graders to write a paragraph using adjectives that are drawn from the 5 senses. And all of the children were looking at and handling some kind of a food item. Kind of a neat intersection of kinesthetic learning, because they all had real food, with some written work. The assignment does ask you to include both a blank version of the assessment. This is an example of a blank version of the assessment, and the assignment asks you to include at least 2 samples from the kids completed. Okay. Slide, you're looking at a movie. If you look at this slide, you can see the skills. Effectively utilizes an opening sentence. Paragraph includes descriptive words from all 5 senses, and effectively uses a closing sentence are represented here. Okay, students will understand a paragraph as a self-contained unit of writing. Students will understand that a descriptive paragraph must contain 3 essential elements: an opening sentence, descriptions using 5 sentences, and a closing sentence. They will demonstrate this knowledge in their drafting assignment. Okay, and you can see the standards: use frequently occurring adjectives, recall events or experiences. So what shows up in the rubric is aligned to the goals and standards of the lesson. This is little bit different for you, and I obviously will not be looking for this in your assignment because in many cases you are not the one that created the lesson. If you have some information about the standards, great, use them to create the rubric. If you are using the assessment from a lesson that you planned, make sure to go back and look at your own goals and standards. Okay, so then you're going to do two things to describe the patterns of learning. So basically describe what the children took away from this lesson. What does the assessment say about their patterns of learning? Okay, the first thing that you're going to do is analyze their patterns of learning quantitatively. And for this, quantitatively means numerically. And for this, you are going to create a graph. A graph is one of the most clear-cut visual ways to show patterns of learning to a reader, right? So I can very clearly see patterns of learning, okay? So this example on this slide is from the example we've been looking at along, scores on the descriptive paragraph. And you can see in this assignment, there are a couple of children that really struggled, and then the vast majority of the children in the class did fairly well on the assignment. I will tell you that this is not the most meaningful data. So from that, I can pretty much only derive that a few of the children struggled, most of the kids did fairly well, only one of the kids got a perfect score. That's what I can derive from this graph. In general, I tend to find that final assessment scores, so 7 out of 10 in this case, 14 out of 15, tend to not give us a lot of data, especially for planning purposes. Okay, all I can say from this is the vast majority of the kids understood most of the learning outcomes, but I cannot tell you about the kids who struggled, what they struggled on, and even the kids who did well, was there any pattern in which pieces of the assignment were more difficult or not, right? So there's a lot of kids with 13s, 12s, and one kid with an 11 out of 15, and then two with an 8 and one with a 7. Like, what are the common mistakes that were made there? That will tell me more when I go to plan the next lesson than just the vast majority of them got it, okay, which is what I can see from here. This is not a bad graph. It's not an excellent graph. I do think that the person who did this could have done a better job in giving us meaningful data. But I wanted to include it because I've been showing you this example all along. Here's some other examples from different assignments. So the top one is a pie chart showing the percentage of students able to describe a pig's value and work. So from this, I can very clearly see that the like half of the class got a 3. So they got the highest points on the rubric. This, by the way, means nothing to me without the associated rubric, which is one of the reasons why I'm asking you to include that evaluation criteria. This graph could certainly be improved by clearly delineating what the rubric scores mean instead of just saying rubric score 3, rubric score 2, rubric score 1. This next bar chart is a different kind of assessment, but one that is incredibly meaningful. And this is a great example of somebody who didn't just do a 9 out of 10 or an 8 out of 8 kind of graph. And by the way, student teacher, did correct spelling of ED sounding words. So the learning objectives here were for children to be able to accurately write past tense words. In this case, the student teacher is looking at both a pretest and a final test. So in this case, the students were given an assessment before the lesson on which words they could spell, and then one after the lesson, series of lessons, and which one that they could spell. And this gives us a lot of really meaningful data because not only can we clearly see here that almost all of the students improved, basically everyone was able to spell lifted and have pre and before, pre and post. But it also tells us that which of the words were more difficult for the children as a whole, right? So you can see that grinned was clearly more difficult than waved and sounded. And that very few of the children could accurately spell tripped or parked at the beginning. Both tripped and grinned were challenging all the way along. And that's a very interesting piece because you can see that in both of those words there was a double consonant. Because I know this particular student teacher's work, I can share with you that that was one of her takeaways, that they understood the ED, but the previous lesson was on the need to sort of double the consonant, and it didn't translate. So when they added the sort of the past tense layer to it, one of her deductions after this, her analysis pieces and then into formative assessment, was that she needed to go back and review the two spelling rules together, which you can clearly see from this data. It's very meaningful data in comparison to just a 5 out of 8, a 7 out of 8, right? Because then we wouldn't know which patterns, which words were more difficult for the children. This last bar graph is a smaller group. It's not a whole class. It's a 5 child guided reading group. And you can see these are the learning outcomes and rubric points for this particular assessment. And they were learning about real versus not real characters. And in this case, the student teacher has graphed the scores of each of the individual children on the rubric. And so you can see which of the skills was more difficult and which of the children struggled more. This is very meaningful data. This kind of data is possible because it's a group of 5, but I wanted to show it to you because you can absolutely graph the percentage of students with rubric scores on different components of the rubric. If your rubric is looking at more than one outcome and more than one skill, a way to get around that sort of, I just know if they overall did well or poor, is to graph the percentage of students who scored a 1, a 2, or a 3 on the rubric. In this case, it was a 3-point Likert scale rubric. So we can see the proficiency in different skills that are being looked at. These are great examples of graphs and a way to really think about what am I really wanting to know? What is the meaningful questions around the assessment that I chose to. The next section asks you to describe the qualitative patterns of learning. So in this case, you're going to describe patterns of learning used, and you're going to describe them using words. Okay, so I want you to pay particular attention to any patterns of learning that weren't represented in your graph. Okay, oftentimes there are patterns that you just can't get at with your graph. So if you look at the example below, the way that the student who did the project, the written paragraph around the 5 senses, got around the lack of meaningful data in her bar graph is that she created an extensive narrative to help us understand what the patterns that weren't in the graph actually were. Okay, so she said things like the majority of the opening sentences tended to replicate the example I gave in class during our whole group lesson. Here's an example. I am going to teach you about grapes, or whichever the food the student had chosen. She also included the sentence that said the 3 students who scored below an 11 of 15 were not able to complete their drafts. So she's using words to explain the patterns that weren't visible in her graph. Okay. Also in this qualitative piece, you want to describe any outliers. Okay. So these are assessments that are not typical of the larger patterns. So specific examples of mistakes or successes that are not part of a larger pattern of learning, but are still significant. For example, a single student that didn't understand the assignment, okay? Or, the majority of the students made mistakes in this learning outcome. However, 3 students also demonstrated a mistake in learning outcome 2, okay? And throughout your qualitative section, and you're just going to have like a paragraph explaining the patterns, you must use specific examples from children's work. Okay, so don't just say the opening sentences tended to replicate the example I gave. Include a couple, 1 or 2 examples from the student's work of what the opening sentences looked like. The next step is to analyze the patterns of learning. So you've created a graph and you've written a paragraph that explain what the patterns are, but the next thing that you need to do is analyze it. So you have to describe what the patterns of learning mean. And in the assignment, I've given you guiding questions to think about as you describe what the patterns of learning mean. Did the students meet the learning objectives? How do you know that? If they're still struggling, what skills or understandings are they still struggling with? Are they able to demonstrate their learning using the selected assessment? For example, in the assessment we've been talking about, the kids that weren't able to complete their draft, they're all kids that have IEPs and are developmentally behind in certain ways, one of which is the ability to write. Okay, so it's very possible that those children weren't able to demonstrate their assessment, what they knew, using this assessment vehicle. And in fact, in that example, we know for sure that that's the case because she also assessed their learning using another format, and those students were successful in a sort of more oral format of participation. And the last question really ties to what I just said. What misunderstandings or issues with the selected assessment may have prevented them from demonstrating their learning on the selected assessment? This is asking you to go back and look at, were there mistakes in the tool itself? Right? If I could redesign this assessment after I've done it, would I change some things to make sure I was accurately collecting data? The last piece goes back to what I started the whole presentation with. What is formative assessment? Is this idea of using assessment to inform instruction. Again, in the assignment guidelines, there's very clear things that you want to be describing in this, right? So based on the patterns and your analysis, what are your next steps? How does this assignment and your understanding, the data you just collected, your understanding of the data's meaning, how does that impact what you do tomorrow with the kids? Okay, both as a whole and then in terms of differentiation. Okay, and then I fear that this next sentence might have sent a few people into a place of concern because it has a lot of academic language where it says consider the active and multimodal nature of children's learning and the variety of learners in your class who may require different strategies and supports. When I say the active and multimodal nature of children's learning, I just want you to think about the fact that they're young kids and they need to be active and they need methods of engagement, and that not everybody learns the same way. That's the whole point of multimodal nature of young children, right? That like some of us need to move our bodies and some of us need to look at something and some of us need to listen to something. So I want you to consider that when you look at the children who struggle, the children who need challenge, when you look at the patterns of learning, when you are thinking about how do I move forward with this class, I want you to think about what do I know about these kids and like how does that inform what I do next? And then since the vast majority of you are going back to this class next week, even though you're not teaching the next lesson and you're just supporting children, what did you learn from this project that will change or supports what you're already doing with the kids in the classroom? Okay, so I want you to reflect a little bit about your own interactions with these children and how the data that you just collected on them could inform the way that you spend the rest of your time this quarter with them. That's the assignment. It's not as difficult as it seems. There's a lot of academic language in the assignment itself, but that's really intentional. Okay, you are reaching a point. Everyone in these classes are reaching a point in their program where you're ready to tackle some pretty intense academic language. And if you have further questions or concerns, please feel free to let me know. I will be available this weekend to support people if they need some help with the assignment. If you want to submit a draft, that's great. Okay. Also, if you submit something and it's really